London, June 3, 1944. Beneath King Charles Street, under 20 feet of concrete, the air trembled with the sound of teletype hammers and exhaustion. Cigarette smoke hung so thick it looked like fog. Somewhere above, the rain hit the city like static. Down here, the war was fought in silence. Every few seconds, another coded transmission rattled through the wires. Numbers, letters, nonsense. But the men at the desks didn't hear nonsense. They heard ghosts. Ghosts of missing agents gone dark across occupied France. For 3 days, no Allied field operative in Normandy had reported in. It wasn't random. Someone, or something, had shut down the entire network. At 02:15, Lieutenant Harold Hal Whitman was still awake, his tie undone, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He was 27 years old, a mathematician from Chicago who thought in equations and rhythm. He had been ordered to rest hours ago. He hadn't moved. A junior officer whispered near the back, "We've lost them all, haven't we?" Whitman didn't look up. He tapped the cipher sheet with a pencil, muttering, "Not lost, hidden." He saw what the others didn't, a pattern inside the chaos. Repeated timing gaps, 3 letters at uneven intervals. Not random static, but hesitation. He knew that hesitation. He'd seen it before, not in code books, but in men. "Who's keying the messages?" he asked. "Unknown. Likely Enigma upgrade, Luftwaffe channel." "No," Whitman said quietly. "It's human, and he's tired." He grabbed his notebook, ripped a sheet in half, and started rewriting the cipher sequence. Backwards. "You can't do that," a supervisor snapped. "That's not the procedure." Whitman smiled faintly. "Procedure's the reason we're deaf." For the next 10 minutes, his hand didn't stop moving. Symbols, arrows, intervals. He built a new algorithm by instinct, skipping every rule in the Allied manual. A single desk lamp lit his notes. At 02:43, he hit the final line. The teletype beside him spat out a clean string of words. German, perfectly legible. His heart stopped. "Netzplan aktiv. Verbindungen Normandy. Caen, Le Havre, Cherbourg." A transmission map. He'd just cracked the first message of an entire network. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled, and whispered, "Got you." By sunrise, the entire basement was alive. Operators shouted coordinates. Radios whined as the signal corps confirmed it. Enemy transmissions were no longer invisible. The next 36 hours would be chaos, brilliance, and pure defiance. Whitman had crossed a line that could ruin him and change the war. He poured coffee over his trembling hands and said to no one in particular, 3 days. Give me 3 days." The man who broke the rules was about to break the enemy instead. Every man in the bunker believed the same thing. Machines didn't lie. The Enigma was sacred, a fortress of logic built from rotors and mathematics. The British had Bletchley Park, the Americans had Arlington Hall, and both had spent years proving that human intuition couldn't outthink a cipher. You needed punch cards, time, and discipline, not imagination. Lieutenant Harold Whitman didn't buy it. To him, the Enigma wasn't perfect. It was human, and anything made by men carried their fingerprints: impatience, fatigue, pride. No one ever built a flawless rhythm, he used to say. Even God rested on the 7th day. The doctrine said otherwise. The Signal Corps' official encryption manual demanded that all decryption attempts follow rigid process. Frequency analysis, rotor alignment, time markers, cross-verification, and manual punch validation. Every step took hours. By the time a message was decrypted, the battlefield it described had already changed. That was the paradox of modern war. Intelligence that arrived too late to save anyone. Whitman's mind didn't work in hours. It worked in pulses. When he looked at code, he didn't see letters or keys. He saw rhythm. He could hear it. He'd tap out the patterns on the edge of the desk, counting how the intervals between groups stretched and contracted. "That's not math," his commanding officer once said. "That's jazz." He'd smiled. Exactly. The rest of the cryptography division didn't see a genius. They saw a problem. The man refused to use official templates, skipped verification chains, and had already been warned twice for using unauthorized logic charts, self-made ciphers scrawled on coffee filters and ration envelopes. The higher-ups tolerated him because his numbers worked. In March 1944, he had predicted the location of 3 Luftwaffe control frequencies purely by rhythm analysis, without ever breaking the cipher. But now, his behavior wasn't eccentric. It was insubordination. The deeper problem wasn't just Whitman. It was the culture. Allied intelligence had begun to worship machines. The bomb and Colossus dominated the war rooms. Analysts were trained to wait for results, not think between them. A machine either cracked the code or it didn't. Human creativity had become a liability. But Whitman had one advantage no machine could replicate: empathy. He didn't just calculate the code. He imagined the man sending it. What did fatigue sound like in Morse? What did fear look like in rhythm? That's what he heard in the transmissions out of Normandy. Tiny irregularities. Pauses that weren't mechanical but emotional. Someone on the other end was rushing, maybe hiding something, maybe scared. Machines could never read fear. Humans could. When his superior caught him working off book, Whitman didn't defend himself. He just said, "You built machines to break code. I built a code to break men." By the next night, every operator in London's listening posts knew his name. Some called him reckless, some called him mad. But one British analyst summed it up perfectly in his diary. "The Yanks have a mathematician who listens to ghosts in the static. And the ghosts seem to talk back." Before the war, Harold Whitman wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even supposed to be part of the army. He was a university dropout, a restless prodigy who lived on caffeine and equations, and who believed that logic without rebellion was dead. He'd grown up on the south side of Chicago, the only child of a widowed math teacher who tutored students out of their kitchen. By age 10, he could calculate cube roots faster than his mother's adding machine. By 16, he was solving differential equations for fun and getting expelled for rewriting the answers on the blackboard. He wasn't arrogant. He was allergic to limits. When he entered MIT on a full scholarship in 1935, professors expected a star. What they got was an insomniac who argued with them about prime distribution and spent nights inside the radio lab teaching himself Morse code. He had a habit of muttering numbers under his breath, chasing invisible patterns no one else could see. His downfall came when he broke into the faculty encryption test, a harmless experiment designed to evaluate student ciphers. Whitman cracked it in 8 minutes, re-encrypted the message backwards, and left a note on the department head's desk that read, "If I can read your secrets, so can the Germans." They expelled him for academic misconduct. 2 years later, when the war began, the same dean wrote him a letter of recommendation to the U.S. Army Signal Corps. "If you must employ a heretic," it said, "make sure he's on your side." Whitman arrived at Arlington Hall in 1941, a compound of mathematicians, linguists, and engineers trying to untangle the Axis encrypted networks. The work was repetitive and soul-crushing, endless streams of numbers, long nights with no answers. The military loved procedure. Whitman hated it. He ignored dress codes, played jazz records in the decoding room, and rewrote official ciphers into patterns that made musical sense. When one colonel told him that the army didn't need artists, he answered, "Then stop painting targets." But behind the sarcasm, there was brilliance. His early algorithms predicted Luftwaffe frequency jumps with 92% accuracy, saving dozens of bombers from ambush in 1943. His models for transmission delay were so precise they were quietly adopted by Bletchley Park analysts under British code names. Still, his relationship with authority stayed volatile. Commanders called him the cowboy cryptographer. To most, he was either a miracle worker or a liability. One colleague later said, "Harold didn't crack codes. He cracked people, their habits, their laziness, their pride, and he turned all of it into math. By the time he was transferred to London in 1944, the Allies were winning the air war but losing the intelligence race. The Germans had changed their encryption schedule. New rotor sequences every 24 hours, message bursts timed to jam decoders. Machines were falling behind, analysts were blind, and for the first time, Allied command was terrified of silence. Whitman arrived with one suitcase, a stack of notebooks, and a reputation that preceded him. The British liaison officer shook his hand and said, "We've heard of you. You're the one who doesn't like rules." Whitman smiled, shrugged, and replied, "Rules make better enemies than friends." It would be the last joke anyone in that bunker told for 3 days. By the evening of June 2nd, 1944, silence had become the most dangerous sound in London. Allied listening posts that once pulsed with encrypted Morse were now quiet, except for faint static and the occasional burst of meaningless noise. Field agents in occupied France, operatives vital to D-Day's groundwork, had stopped transmitting. 34 agents across 3 sectors, all gone dark. At first, the Signal Corps thought it was weather, then sabotage, then fear. But to Whitman, silence was never empty. It had weight, rhythm, decay. To him, even absence carried structure. The problem was time. German encryption updates were rolling faster than machines could adapt. Enigma keys rotated every 24 hours, then 12, and now, frighteningly, 6. By the time one message was cracked, 5 more had already vanished into unreadable noise. It wasn't just a technological race. It was a death clock. Every minute without contact meant another agent potentially exposed. Each failed decryption meant convoys sailing blind, soldiers walking into ambushes, and resistance networks dying unseen. Whitman wrote it on the chalkboard himself. 1 message equals 1 life. 6-hour window equals 360 minutes. 360 minutes, 10-minute analysis equals 36 lives per code cycle. That was his battlefield math. Precision turned to horror. For 3 days, Allied command had been feeding Enigma intercepts into the decoding machines at Bletchley Park and Arlington Hall. Results: 0 readable outputs. A colonel slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "We're losing men faster than we can listen to them." Whitman didn't answer. He was staring at a set of transcripts pinned to the wall, his finger tracing patterns in the timing of German transmissions. 1.7 seconds between bursts, then 1.6, then 1.8. Not random, not electronic. Human. Someone on the other end was operating under stress, maybe fatigue. That, he realized, was the flaw. Machines assumed randomness. But people, even trained operators, made mistakes. They retyped keys, hesitated, reused patterns they thought were invisible. A tired man at a radio was the weakest cipher on Earth. Whitman began building what he called probability shadows, mathematical ghosts of human imperfection. He charted them like fingerprints. Within hours, he'd mapped out a repeating pattern across 2,800 messages. The same operator working 3 different stations, his rhythm betraying every disguise. The room buzzed with disbelief when Whitman presented it. A senior cryptanalyst frowned. "You're saying we can decode the Enigma through personality?" Whitman shrugged. "I'm saying fatigue's a language. You just have to learn how to listen." His unorthodox method made no sense to traditionalists. But the math didn't lie. Each intercepted message followed a pulse, not in content, but in the rhythm of its creation. The Germans had made their system too human. For the first time in weeks, Whitman smiled. "They're not ghosts," he said quietly, "Bub. They're just tired men pretending to be machines." He wiped his chalkboard clean, rolled up his sleeves, and scrawled a new equation at the top. Speed equals survival. Silence equals pattern. Pattern equals break. In that moment, the war of numbers became a war of nerves. And Harold Whitman was about to turn silence into a weapon. By the morning of June 3rd, the war room had turned into a morgue. The analysts were pale, their uniforms damp from sweat, their coffee long gone cold. Command wanted answers. The machines wanted time. Whitman wanted neither. He sat alone at a side desk, sleeves rolled, shirt unbuttoned, a halo of papers surrounding him. He had reached the limit of patience and the edge of his own authority. At 0512, he opened his notebook and began to write an equation that did not exist in any Allied manual. He called it a mirror stream. The others called it madness. Instead of decoding the Germans' encryption directly, he flipped the process, predicting the human side of the Enigma's operators. His algorithm didn't try to solve the code. It tried to anticipate the mistakes that would appear inside it. It was mathematical heresy. A British supervisor stopped by his desk and frowned at the unfamiliar notations. "What are you doing?" Whitman didn't look up. "Teaching the machine to make mistakes. That's not allowed. Neither is losing 34 men." The forbidden algorithm used probability weights derived from fatigue intervals, the exact timing inconsistencies he discovered earlier. The more tired the operator, the more predictable his error signature became. The Germans thought they were being random. They weren't. At 0620, he fed the intercepted transmissions through his self-written program, a patch built by hand on top of the official cipher engine. It bypassed 3 of the Signal Corps' security protocols and rewired the teleprinter output to a direct line. One spark of wrong math and he could have erased the system. He pressed the switch anyway. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then the paper feed began to stutter, the letters coming too fast to read. One analyst shouted, "Sir, you're going to overload the buffer." Whitman smiled grimly. "Then it'll work faster." The noise built until suddenly it stopped. The room froze. The machine whirred once more and printed a line so clear it looked like it had been typed by hand. "Standby order. Nets K operational. Transmission nodes, Caen, Le Havre, Cherbourg." Every man in the room went silent. The words were German, but not encrypted. His algorithm had cracked through the noise into coherence. Whitman leaned forward, eyes wide. "That's not their message traffic," he said. "That's their infrastructure." He printed another, and another. In 15 minutes, they had a full map of the German communication net across northern France. By 07:00, Allied intelligence had something no one thought possible: real-time access to enemy channels. But it came at a price. The patch Whitman had written violated a dozen military regulations. It rewired an official decryption console and compromised classified signal security. If Command found out, he'd face court-martial, maybe worse. He didn't care. As the first decoded maps reached Command, an officer clapped him on the shoulder and said, "How the hell did you do it?" Whitman wiped sweat from his forehead. "Illegally." For the first time in the war, the Allies weren't reacting. They were listening, alive, to the enemy breathe. And in that breath, Whitman heard the sound of collapse beginning. By noon, the code room on King Charles Street was chaos. Officers shouted coordinates. Runners dashed between desks. The hum of machinery had turned manic, like the heartbeat of a creature that had just realized it was alive. But no one knew exactly why the machine worked. Whitman stood over the printer, sleeves rolled up, watching his creation do what the world's best cryptographic hardware couldn't: think wrong. It was decoding in leaps, not lines, skipping across German traffic like a jazz riff improvising over chaos. A young analyst named Phelps leaned in, eyes wide. "Sir, how the hell is it reading Enigma without keys?" Whitman didn't look up. "It isn't. It's reading the people who use them." The algorithm shouldn't have been possible. Allied encryption theory relied on deterministic mathematics, systems that followed rules, predictable and provable. Whitman's patch was neither. It used chaos as logic, reading imperfections in transmission speed, operator rhythm, and even electrical static from the German radios. He called it entropy shadowing. Every time a human touched a key, The rhythm betrayed intent. A slight lag here, an overcorrection there. His code traced those inconsistencies like a hunter following footprints. It didn't break the cipher. It broke the man behind it. To the brass, that was witchcraft. To Whitman, it was pattern recognition in its purest form. "Machines obey logic," he muttered. "Humans leak it." At 12:46, one of the printers sputtered and jammed. The line before it stopped read, "Signal relay. Nets 6 compromised. Request new channel rotation." Whitman froze. That message meant the Germans knew something was wrong. His system was working too well. The enemy was changing frequencies mid-operation. Phelps panicked. "Sir, if they rotate, we lose them again." Whitman thought for a moment, then smiled. "No, we predict the rotation." It was the same logic as chess. Not solving the move, but anticipating it. He fed in the previous transmission intervals, adjusted his shadow weight model, and pressed enter. The printer screamed to life. Seconds later, new intercepts appeared on paper, perfectly aligned with the Germans' new frequency. "Jesus," Phelps whispered. "You're following them live." "Not following," Whitman said softly. "Dancing." For 48 minutes, the room spun with disbelief as the algorithm predicted every German shift, every attempted concealment. It was as if the enemy had been stripped naked in real time. But there was a darker edge to the success. Whitman's patch wasn't just intercepting messages. It was altering the Allied decoding infrastructure, rerouting signal priority, and bypassing security layers. His console glowed red from heat. Every second it ran increased the risk of meltdown or trace detection. An officer shouted over the noise, "If command sees that output, you'll be court-martialed." Whitman smirked. "If command sees this output, they'll win the war." He was right. Within an hour, the decrypted data exposed an entire network of German radio operators transmitting false coordinates to lure Allied bombers off course. The Allies had been flying into traps for weeks. Now they had the trapmaker's map. Whitman leaned against the desk, hands shaking from exhaustion, and whispered, "You can't encrypt exhaustion. You can't encrypt pride." And that's what they built their war on. He had broken the code, not with power, not with machines, but with human imperfection. By the time the day ended, the forbidden algorithm had cracked 413 transmissions in less than 3 days. The miracle had worked, and everyone in that room knew. It shouldn't have. By the second night, sleep was a myth. The air in the bunker had gone stale, a blend of tobacco, sweat, and ozone from the overheated machines. The room pulsed with noise, clattering teletypes, muttered code groups, the metallic hum of exhaustion. Whitman hadn't eaten in 30 hours. He was fueled by adrenaline and black coffee that tasted like rust. On the wall behind him, a massive map of France was pinned with colored markers, each one representing an intercepted transmission source. The dots began to cluster. Caen, Le Havre, Cherbourg. The German network wasn't random. It was triangulated. Whitman stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "They're not just transmitting intelligence," he said. "They're relaying orders. Every one of these signals is coming from a command relay disguised as a weather station." A British major leaned over the console. "You're saying we've been bombing the wrong sites?" Whitman didn't answer. He pointed to the pattern on the map. 3 perfect lines converging on Normandy's coast. They built their own communications triangle. If we cut one corner, the others go blind. It was elegant, terrifying, and now visible. He turned back to his machine and rewired a direct line to the intercept feed. The teletype clattered to life again, spitting out data faster than anyone could copy it. Phelps struggled to keep up, typing decoded coordinates on a separate sheet. "Message frequency increasing," Phelps said. "They know something's wrong." Whitman kept typing. "Then they'll talk faster and make more mistakes." The room fell silent as the next line came through. VNet's Gruppe 9. Priority cipher red. Forward all Allied signals to Paris relay. Whitman stopped cold. That meant the Germans weren't just encrypting their own transmissions. They were intercepting Allied traffic. He scribbled a note and handed it to the major. They're listening to us while we listen to them. A new kind of war had begun. Recursive intelligence. Within an hour, Whitman's team had isolated 3 key frequencies and traced the origin signatures using operator delay variants, a fancy term for human rhythm. It wasn't radar. It was intuition weaponized by math. Each pulse, each breath, each stutter of a tired radio man became a breadcrumb leading to a transmitter. At 0317, the first location was confirmed, a disguised farm on the outskirts of Caen. Within 10 minutes, Royal Air Force intelligence had the coordinates. Within an hour, a squadron of mosquitoes was airborne. Whitman stood by the radio, headset on, listening to the strike reports come in through bursts of static. Target 1, direct hit. He closed his eyes, relief mixed with guilt. Target 2, silenced. He nodded silently. Target 3, transmitting no more. By dawn, 3 red pins were removed from the map. The Germans tried to re-establish contact. They couldn't. Whitman's algorithm caught every attempt, every misfired signal, every desperate operator sending ghost messages into the dark. He turned to his exhausted team, voice hoarse. We've cut their ears off. All of them. Phelps exhaled. Sir, how long before they figure it out? Whitman looked at his watch. 3 days. That's all they've got. And he was right. In those 3 days, the enemy's silence became deafening. Their coordination collapsed. Their agents in Normandy were suddenly alone, blind, leaderless, and exposed. The battle for D-Day's secret skies had been fought not with bombs or bullets, but in bursts of code, sweat, and stubborn genius. And Harold Whitman, the rogue mathematician who refused to follow orders, had just turned static into victory. June 5th, 1944. The night before D-Day. In the basement under King Charles Street, every lamp burned low. The walls vibrated faintly from distant thunder, or maybe artillery echoing from across the channel. Dozens of operators hunched over their teletypes, their eyes hollow, their uniforms stained with ink and sweat. And in the center, Harold Whitman stood completely still, watching the signals die one by one. For 3 straight days, he and his patchwork algorithm had chased the German network across France. Now, there was only one cluster left, a final transmission hub somewhere near Le Havre, spitting out coded bursts every 11 minutes. If he could kill it, the entire network would collapse before the first Allied landing craft touched Normandy's sand. But there was a problem. His algorithm was burning out. The console was overheating, sparking at the edges. The emergency fuse had already melted twice. The system wasn't meant to run this long, this hard. Sir, Phelps said, voice shaking, the circuits won't take another run. You'll fry it. Whitman's eyes didn't move. Then it dies doing something useful. He turned a dial, overrode the safeties, and forced the last frequency sweep through the machine. The lights flickered. The sound that came from the teletype wasn't mechanical. It was almost alive, like the room itself exhaled. At 23:57, the machine printed one final sequence of coordinates. Then it stopped. Smoke rose from the console. The air smelled of ozone and ink. Whitman tore the strip free, read it once, and handed it to the British major standing beside him. There, he said quietly. That's their throat. The major didn't hesitate. Within 5 minutes, the coordinates were on their way to RAF Bomber Command. At 01:22, the sky above Le Havre erupted. Allied mosquitoes and bullfighters dove through the clouds, streaking toward a cluster of warehouses disguised as shipping depots. The explosions rolled through the night like thunder over water. German radio transmissions flickered, sputtered, and then nothing. Silence. Not static, not interference. Real, absolute silence. In the command bunker, the radio operators looked up, waiting for the next pulse that never came. One whispered, "We lost them." Whitman sat back in his chair and said, "No, they lost us." The teletype, still smoking, spit out a final half-burned line before dying for good. Netzwerk bendit. Signal verloren. Network terminated. Signal lost. For a long moment, no one moved. Then someone laughed, just once, out of disbelief. Another followed. Within seconds, the whole room was cheering, pounding desks, clapping backs. After 3 days of running on fear, caffeine, and adrenaline, the impossible had happened. They'd shut down the enemy's ears. At 02:30, a new message came through, this time from Allied headquarters. "All clear for Operation Neptune. Weather holding. Proceed." Whitman didn't celebrate. He just stared at the silent machine, its wires blackened and warped, and whispered, "You did your job." When D-Day began hours later, thousands of ships crossed the channel unseen by German eyes. Their radar operators never got the call. Their radio commands never reached the beaches. Because somewhere in a basement in London, a man who broke every rule had turned chaos into silence, and silence into salvation. By dawn, the war had changed shape. Not with bullets, not with bombs, but with one illegal algorithm and a mathematician who refused to stop listening. The morning after D-Day, London's war rooms were alive with a different kind of noise. Not panic, but disbelief. Reports flooded in from Normandy. Communication breakdowns across German divisions, command paralysis, entire battalions unable to receive orders. Allied units advancing inland met confused, leaderless defenders. What had begun as a risky gamble was now a cascade of advantage. In one cramped office, Lieutenant Harold Whitman sat slumped at his desk, barely conscious, uniform stained with oil and sweat. His machine was dead. Charred circuits and melted paper reels. His body felt the same. For 72 hours he had eaten almost nothing, slept not at all. But his mind was still racing, tracing invisible rhythms across the airwaves. A general from the Signal Corps walked in, his tone clipped and cold. "Lieutenant, did you alter a decryption console without authorization?" Whitman didn't look up. "Yes, sir." "Do you realize that's a violation of the Official Secrets Act, Articles 3 through 7? "Yes, sir." "Do you realize you've compromised secured Allied systems?" "No, sir. I fixed them." The general stared at him for a long moment, then nodded toward a classified file in his hand. "Your little experiment decoded 413 enemy messages and shut down their command relay. But it also rewrote 3 layers of our own encryption. Half of Bletchley Park wants you arrested." Whitman managed a faint smile. "The other half wants my notes." He wasn't wrong. For the next 24 hours, Allied intelligence fought its own quiet war over what to do with him. Technically, he had broken international protocol, modified secure Allied equipment, and conducted unsanctioned cryptographic operations, all federal offenses. But every intercepted German message recovered since confirmed it. The Axis spy network in France was gone. 27 embedded German agents, the backbone of the Abwehr's French operation, had been identified, tracked, and neutralized. Entire spy cells collapsed before sunrise. The message summaries were brutal and efficient. Agent captured, relay destroyed, no further contact. Whitman's work hadn't just saved intelligence channels, it had crippled the enemies. But none of it could be made public. The operation was too sensitive, too strange, too unorthodox to explain. There would be no press releases, no medals, no promotion. The official report buried the incident under a new designation. Operation Echo Silence. Data inconclusive. When the general returned the next morning, he didn't offer congratulations. He simply said, "You'll be transferred, temporarily, under classification." Whitman frowned. "You mean buried?" "Call it protection," the general replied. "You don't exist anymore." Within a week, every record of Lieutenant Harold Whitman's involvement in the Normandy Code breaches disappeared. His file was redacted, his personnel record reassigned, his name removed from every dispatch. To history, he became a ghost. Years later, when post-war intelligence officers reviewed the archives, they found a missing serial number in the 1944 Signal Corps logs, a gap where an officer should have been listed. The entry beside it simply read, "Personnel erased. Success classified." No one in the room knew it, but the erasure had a name. Whitman didn't want fame. He only ever wanted clarity. And in that, he succeeded. The silence he'd created that night had been perfect, mathematical, almost divine. He once wrote in his notebook, "Noise is human. Silence is victory." On the night the German airwaves went dark, he had given the Allies both. The spy who broke the enemy never wore a disguise, never crossed enemy lines, never fired a gun. He just listened harder than anyone else, and vanished into the static he'd mastered. After the war, Harold Whitman returned to Chicago with a limp briefcase, a single suit, and the kind of exhaustion that seeps into the soul. There were no parades, no interviews, no records of his service. His discharge papers simply read, "Technical Liaison, Communications Section." He taught high school mathematics under a different name. He rented a one-room apartment above a bakery and spent his evenings grading papers, chain-smoking, and listening to jazz on an old radio. The static between songs still made him twitch. He never spoke about the war, not once. But sometimes, when the night was quiet and the city felt like it was breathing, he'd trace invisible symbols across his desk with a pencil, rhythms only he could see. In 1967, one of his students, a bright young girl named Elaine, stayed after class. She had just been accepted to a university engineering program and wanted advice. "Do you really think math can save lives?" she asked. Whitman paused, then smiled faintly. "It can, if you're willing to break a few rules." It was the only time anyone ever heard him mention the war. 2 years later, when he died quietly in his sleep, the local paper ran a 3-line obituary. Harold W. Mann, educator, age 52, beloved teacher, veteran. Nothing more. But across the ocean, in a dusty British archive at Bletchley Park, a file was quietly declassified. Inside was a single page, yellowed, handwritten, signed only H.W. It read, 3 days, 413 messages, 27 agents caught. Method unauthorized. Result, successful. At the bottom, a note in pencil. For the record, patterns are human. Machines just catch them slower. Historians who stumbled upon the page decades later didn't know the name. There were no service numbers, no citations, just those initials. And an algorithm no one had ever officially built. But for the men who fought at Normandy, for the agents who survived because the enemy couldn't call for help, his silence echoed louder than any victory song. The man who broke the rules had done what the machines couldn't. He'd turned empathy into arithmetic, rhythm into warfare, and chaos into clarity. And in the end, the war that was fought with tanks and fire and steel had also been won, in part, by one quiet mathematician who saw what everyone else ignored. The pattern. If you listen hard enough, you can still hear it in the hum of an old radio, the pause between transmissions, the whisper of static before a song begins. The war gave him no medals, but it gave him the one thing no one else ever heard, the sound of victory in silence.